Late in the evening, when the official meetings had ended and the grand rooms of the palace grew quiet, President Macron sat alone with his phone resting on the polished desk. Outside, Paris was calm, its lights reflecting softly on the river, but inside his mind the day was still alive with voices, promises, and unresolved questions. Public speeches were easy compared to this moment. Cameras, applause, and carefully chosen words belonged to the daytime. Night belonged to private messages, the short lines of text that could change the direction of a conversation, a relationship, or even history. Macron believed that leadership was not only about standing confidently in front of people. It was also about listening carefully when no one else was watching. Over the years, he had learned that a private message could sometimes do what a long speech could not. A few honest words, sent quietly, could build trust faster than weeks of formal negotiation. This was why he took these moments seriously, rereading each message before replying, thinking not just about what to say, but how it might be received on the other side. Earlier that day, he had spoken publicly about cooperation, unity, and shared values. The words sounded strong and hopeful, and the audience had responded well. Yet he knew that behind every public agreement were dozens of private conversations. Leaders smiled for the cameras, but real understanding often happened later, through messages exchanged late at night or early in the morning. In those messages, the tone was softer, more human, and sometimes uncertain. One message on his screen was from a fellow European leader. It was polite but cautious, expressing concern about an upcoming decision that could affect millions of people. Macron paused before responding. He understood the worry behind the words. This was not a message asking for power or praise, but for reassurance. He typed slowly, choosing language that was clear and calm. He acknowledged the concern, explained his position honestly, and ended with an invitation to continue the discussion. When he pressed send, he felt the familiar mix of relief and responsibility. Private messages had a strange power. They could strengthen friendships, but they could also cause damage if misunderstood or leaked. Macron was aware that in the modern world, no message was ever completely safe. A screenshot, a forwarded text, or a simple mistake could turn a private conversation into a public headline. This awareness made him careful, but it did not make him silent. He believed that fear should not replace communication. As he leaned back in his chair, he remembered a time early in his presidency when a private message had taught him an important lesson. He had written quickly, responding emotionally to criticism from another leader. The message was not rude, but it was sharper than necessary. The response he received was cold, and for weeks afterward, cooperation felt tense and forced. It took time and patience to repair the trust that had been weakened by a few careless sentences. Since then, he had promised himself to never underestimate the weight of written words. For people learning English, Macron's habit of careful messaging offered a valuable lesson. Language was not only about grammar or vocabulary. It was about intention. A simple phrase like, "I understand your concern," could open doors, while a rushed or unclear sentence could close them. In private communication, there were no gestures or facial expressions to soften the meaning. Words had to do all the work on their own. Another message arrived, this time from an advisor. It included updates, suggestions, and a reminder of tomorrow's schedule. Macron smiled slightly. Even within his own team, private messages were essential. They allowed quick decisions and honest feedback. Advisors felt freer to speak openly in a message than in a large meeting room. This honesty helped him see problems earlier and consider different viewpoints before making final decisions. He replied with brief instructions and a note of thanks. Gratitude, he believed, was just as important in private messages as in public speeches. People who felt appreciated were more willing to share their true thoughts. Leadership, after all, was a shared effort, even if one person stood at the center. As the night deepened, Macron reflected on how communication had changed over the years. In the past, leaders wrote long letters that took days to arrive. Now, a message could cross borders in seconds. This speed brought opportunity but also risk. There was less time to reflect, less distance to cool emotions. A leader had to create that pause internally, resisting the urge to respond immediately. He placed the phone face down on the desk and stood up, walking slowly toward the window. The city seemed peaceful, unaware of the quiet conversations shaping its future. He knew that tomorrow, journalists would analyze his public statements, searching for hidden meanings. Few would think about the private messages exchanged in silence, the ones that built bridges or prevented conflicts before they reached the public stage. For learners listening to this story, the idea was simple but powerful. Communication was not only about being correct, it was about being thoughtful. Whether you were a president, a student, or a professional, your private messages reflected your character. They showed how you handled disagreement, how you expressed respect, and how carefully you listened. Macron returned to his desk and picked up the phone one last time. There were no new messages. He felt a sense of calm. The important conversations had been handled with care. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new discussions, and new messages waiting to be written. He turned off the light, knowing that leadership did not end when the cameras disappeared. It continued quietly, line by line, message by message, in the private spaces where trust was built and the future slowly took shape. The news broke early in the morning, spreading across screens and social media feeds before most people had finished their first cup of coffee. Private messages connected to President Macron had become public. Headlines appeared instantly, each one more dramatic than the last. Commentators spoke with urgency, analysts guessed at meanings, and ordinary people shared opinions without knowing the full story. What had once been a quiet exchange between individuals was now part of a global conversation. Macron woke up to the sound of notifications. He already knew what they meant. In modern leadership, nothing stayed hidden for long. He read the reports carefully, noticing how selected sentences were taken out of context and placed under bright public light. The messages were real, but the story being told about them felt incomplete. Words written for one person were now being judged by millions. He dressed calmly and prepared for the day, aware that panic would solve nothing. As he looked in the mirror, he reminded himself of a principle he often shared with his team: clarity was the strongest response to confusion. He did not regret the messages themselves. They were written honestly, during moments of serious discussion. What concerned him was how easily private language could be misunderstood when removed from its original situation. Later that morning, advisors gathered around a large table. Their faces showed concern, but also focus. They discussed the facts, the timing, and the possible reactions. Macron listened more than he spoke. He understood that leadership during a crisis required patience. Every response, whether public or private, would shape how the situation developed. One advisor suggested an immediate statement. Another recommended silence until more information was available. Macron considered both options. He knew that staying silent too long could appear weak, while speaking too quickly could create new problems. Finally, he chose a balanced path. He would speak, but with care, addressing the issue without feeding the drama. In his statement, he explained that private messages were part of everyday communication between leaders. They allowed honesty, disagreement, and cooperation away from the pressure of public performance. He did not deny the messages or attack those who shared them. Instead, he focused on the larger lesson: when private conversations became public, they should be understood responsibly. The public reaction was mixed. Some people appreciated his calm tone and transparency. Others remained critical, believing that leaders should assume all communication might be seen one day. Both sides had valid points. The incident opened a wider discussion about privacy, trust, and technology in the modern world. Behind the scenes, Macron reflected deeply. He thought about how language changed when an audience changed. A message written for one person carried shared history, tone, and understanding. When read by strangers, that same message could seem cold, aggressive, or unclear. This was not only a political issue, but a human one. Everyone had experienced being misunderstood through text at some point in their lives. For learners of English, this situation offered an important example. Words did not exist alone. They lived within context. Understanding a message meant understanding who wrote it, why it was written, and for whom it was intended. Without that context, meaning became fragile and easily broken. As days passed, the intensity of the headlines slowly decreased. New stories appeared, and attention moved on. Yet the experience left a lasting impact on Macron and his team. They reviewed communication practices, discussing how to remain open while protecting trust. They did not decide to stop using private messages. Instead, they became even more intentional about language, tone, and timing. Macron also reached out privately to the individuals involved in the leaked conversations. He expressed regret that their words had been exposed and reassured them of his respect. These messages were short but sincere. Trust, once shaken, required careful rebuilding. He understood that apology was not a sign of weakness, but of responsibility. In quiet moments, he thought about the balance every modern leader faced. Technology allowed instant connection, but it also erased boundaries. The line between public and private had become thin, almost invisible. Navigating this world required not only intelligence, but emotional awareness. Leaders had to imagine multiple audiences, even when writing a simple message. This lesson extended far beyond politics. In offices, classrooms, and families, people communicated through messages every day. A joke could sound rude. A brief reply could feel dismissive. The absence of voice and expression made written language powerful and dangerous at the same time. Choosing words carefully was no longer optional, it was essential. One evening, as Macron reviewed documents in his study, he felt a sense of calm return. The crisis had passed, but the lesson remained clear. Communication was never neutral. Every word carried weight, especially when written. Privacy was valuable, but so was accountability. The challenge was learning to respect both. For those listening to this story to improve their English, the message was simple. Practice not only how to form sentences, but how to feel them. Ask yourself how your words might sound to someone else. Consider tone, clarity, and purpose. Language was more than a tool, it was a bridge between minds. Macron closed his notebook and looked out at the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring new conversations, both public and private. He would continue to speak openly, knowing the risks, because silence helped no one. What mattered was intention, honesty, and respect. In a world where messages could travel faster than thought, wisdom meant slowing down, choosing carefully, and remembering that behind every screen was a human being trying to understand.